Hello there. Let me ask you something. When you think of Victorian men, what comes to mind? A top hat? A walking cane? A stern look in a faded photograph? We often picture them as pillars, upright, unemotional, certain of their place in the world. But what if I told you? Beneath that stiff collar and carefully trimmed mustache was a man quietly unraveling, not from scandal, not from war, but from the ordinary pressure of being exactly what society told him he had to be: a provider, a leader, a stoic mask. And what if I told you that, for many of them, the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the silence. So before you drift off, if this story finds you, give it a like, and maybe subscribe for more like it. Now take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, because tonight, you're waking up in a cold London bedroom, and you've got a long day ahead of you. The room is cold, not brisk, cold. Your breath fogs as you sit up in bed, the cotton sheets stiff from dampness, your joints aching before you've even moved. It's winter in London, somewhere around 1883. You're not poor, you're middle class, which means you can just barely afford the illusion of comfort. The coal in the scuttle is nearly gone. You didn't have enough to feed the fire through the night, and you didn't dare ask the servant to stoke it before dawn. That would mean spending more and showing weakness. You rise in silence, carefully. The bed creaks too much when you rush. You can't wake your wife. She's been angry for days. You don't quite know why. There's tea downstairs, but it's cold, and the milk is beginning to turn. Your shirt collar is starched stiff. It scrapes against your neck. The buttons resist you. Your hands are trembling again, just slightly. From cold, maybe. From something else, too. You dress in the dark, because you know exactly where everything is. Because you're a man, and that's what men do. Downstairs, the maid pretends not to look at you. The boy polishing your boots won't meet your eyes. You could fire them, but you won't. Not because you're kind, but because you need them. They are part of the performance. Because this isn't your home. Not really. It's your stage. Your wife arranged the furniture. Your mother-in-law selected the drapes. You pay the bills. And in return, you are allowed to occupy it, provided you play your part. You tighten your cravat. It used to be silk. Now it's cotton. No one notices. And you wonder, not for the first time, if this is all there is. You haven't had a full night's sleep in months. Not since your manager hinted there might be layoffs. Not since your youngest son coughed blood into his handkerchief. Not since you missed church and the neighbors stopped waving as warmly. You are the man of the house. But this house feels heavier every day. And you haven't told anyone. Because who would you tell? You glance in the mirror, straighten your coat, and step into the cold. The cab is late. You pace by the foggy curb, checking your pocket watch even though you know it's accurate. It's always accurate. You have to be. Every minute wasted feels like a deduction from your reputation. In Victorian London, punctuality isn't just professional. It's moral. A late man is a lazy man, and a lazy man doesn't deserve respect. The streets are a dull grey corridor of smoke and soot. Your eyes sting. Your collar feels tighter with each passing moment. The hansom cab finally arrives. You step in, sit stiffly, and say nothing. Talking to cabbies isn't done. You're not rude, you're appropriate. At the office, the air is thick with ink and damp wool. Rows of men just like you sit at desks that creak. They write. They nod. They do not speak unless spoken to. Your superior walks past. You stand. He does not greet you. He doesn't have to. That's not what this place is for. You sit again, ink your pen, and begin transcribing numbers you barely care about. But they must be exact. Always exact. Your job isn't to be creative or expressive or curious. Your job is to be correct, to be invisible. And so you vanish into it, hour after hour, occasionally shifting in your chair, careful not to seem idle, careful not to show fatigue. Around noon, you eat a sandwich at your desk, cheese again, dry, unwrapped. You don't mind. You tell yourself that, because what matters is that you showed up, that you're doing your duty. Outside, the sun peeks weakly through the fog, but you don't step out. The lunch break is a modern luxury. In your world, breaks are for the idle or the ill. You feel a pressure in your stomach, not quite pain, but not hunger either. It's been building, an ulcer perhaps, or something simpler. The slow erosion of a man who never speaks his fear aloud. You glance at your colleague beside you. He is older, hollow-eyed. Once, he was sharp. Now he seems to move on instinct, head tilted just slightly, as if listening for a sound no one else can hear. You wonder, briefly, if that will be you, if that already is you. The streets are darker now. Horse hooves echo against wet stone, and gas lamps flicker with a low, wavering glow. You ride home in silence again, your thoughts pacing faster than the cab. You try to summon the image of your wife's face, but you're not sure which version of her you'll see tonight. The cheerful one, dressed in powder and grace for dinner guests. The cold one, distant and weary of your presence. Or the one who doesn't speak at all, who has perfected the art of walking past you without looking. You arrive just before 7. The hallway is warm, fragrant with dried lavender and polish. There is a fire crackling faintly in the drawing room. Your youngest daughter plays the piano softly, a French piece. You taught her that. And yet, this house feels foreign to you. You paid for the piano, paid for the lavender, the fire, the wallpaper. But none of it feels like it belongs to you. Your wife appears at the top of the stairs. Her gown is elegant, her expression unreadable. She nods, barely. Dinner will be served shortly. And disappears again. No kiss, no question, no how was your day. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter. Dinner is formal, roast and greens. The children are scrubbed clean and quiet. The servants glide in and out, heads bowed. There is polite conversation about nothing. You answer when spoken to. You smile when appropriate. And inside, your mind drifts to the coal bill, to the office ledger, to the ache in your gut. You sip your wine, slowly. It's not for pleasure. It's a sedative. Later, in the study, you light a lamp and stare into the fire. The ticking clock, the muffled footsteps above, the distant hiss of the gaslight. They are your companions. You pour a small glass of gin. It helps the pain. The one in your stomach. The one behind your eyes. You were raised to be a man, to provide, to endure, to never ask for help. And so you sit, not angry, not weeping, just quiet. Outside the fog thickens. You can barely see the street lamp across the road. And in that flickering half-light, for just a moment, you wonder what would happen if you simply stopped. Stopped trying, stopped pretending, stopped holding it all together. But you don't, because you are a Victorian husband. And the cost of survival is silence. It's past midnight now. The house is still, not peaceful, just muffled, as though all its emotions have been packed away in drawers no one dares open. You lie in bed, staring at the ceiling. Your wife breathes quietly beside you. You are close, but not together. There's been no warmth between you for weeks. And yet, the idea of asking why, of saying anything at all, feels more dangerous than the silence. Your chest tightens slightly. You shift, turn over. The mattress groans beneath you. You wonder if your son heard the noise, if he's lying awake too. A boy already learning that his father is unreachable, not because he is cruel, but because he's collapsing in slow motion. You remember your own father's silence, the rigid routines, the unreadable face at the dinner table, the way he always seemed to be elsewhere, even when he was in the room. You hated it. And now, you are it. You try to sleep, but your mind is still marching, ticking through debts, disappointments, and the dull fear that you are simply not enough. You've done everything right, attended church, maintained appearances, paid what you could, when you could. You even sent your children to school with clean shoes and good Latin. But nothing feels secure. Not your job, not your health, not your marriage. You are expected to be firm, decisive, the spine of your household. But your spine hurts. Your doctor mentioned nervous exhaustion. But you laughed. That's for weak men, for artists and hysterics. You are neither. You are a clerk, a father, a husband, a man in a stiff collar, too proud to unbutton it. Even now, even alone in the dark, the window rattles faintly. A coal cart clatters past outside, and you breathe shallowly, trying not to wake her. Because if she asks what's wrong, you don't have the words to answer. You don't have permission to feel it. All you have is the quiet. In 1892, a small book was published in London with an unassuming title, The Diary of a Nobody. It was written by two brothers, George and Whedon Grossmith, and it didn't look like much, just a series of journal entries by a fictional clerk named Charles Pooter. But beneath the comedy, beneath the satire and dry observations, was something far more revealing. Charles Pooter is not a hero. He's not wealthy. He's not especially clever. He's ordinary, painfully, crushingly ordinary. He worries about his job, about his wife's opinion, about his trousers getting stained. He writes long-winded letters to tradesmen who overcharge him, and then drafts apologies when he fears he's been too stern. His son is unruly, his friends are unreliable, his co-workers mock him behind his back, and yet he tries, so very hard. Every page of his diary hums with effort, to be respectable, to be appreciated, to be in control. He obsesses over etiquette, appearance and status, not because he's vain, but because he's terrified of slipping. One missed payment, one social blunder, and the whole illusion of middle-class stability could collapse. And that's where the tragedy of Charles Pooter lives. He is a man trying to be seen, in a world designed to overlook him. His diary was meant to be funny, and it is. But the reason it endures, the reason readers still feel something when they meet Mr. Pooter, is because so many Victorian men were just like him. Not heroic, not villainous, just quietly unraveling under the pressure to always appear composed. When he buys a new bathtub and no one compliments it, he's devastated. When his wife laughs at his poetry, he doesn't argue. He simply crosses it out. And when his son leaves home in disgrace, he blames himself, but says nothing. Charles Pooter is fictional, but he is also real. Because his diary wasn't written by one man. It was written by thousands, in letters never sent, in pages tucked beneath socks, in the pause before answering, yes, everything is fine, In the same era that Charles Pooter was being quietly mocked, another man was being widely admired, even revered. His name was Samuel Smiles. In 1859, he published a book titled Self-Help, a collection of stories, maxims, and practical advice meant to inspire young men to work hard, persevere, and lift themselves by their own effort. The book was a massive success. It sold over 250,000 copies in its first few decades, a staggering number at the time. Queen Victoria herself kept a copy. To the outside world, Smiles had created a kind of scripture for the middle class. He was a prophet of effort, a preacher of industry, a man whose name became synonymous with moral improvement. And yet, behind that polished public image was a man grappling with the very pressure he'd helped build. Samuel Smiles had grown up in a large, struggling family in Scotland. His father died young. His mother kept the household together. He became a doctor, then a writer, always moving, always working, and always slightly haunted by the fear of failure. He preached about perseverance and privately wrestled with exhaustion. He wrote about financial prudence while quietly struggling with debt. He praised the indomitable will of great men, but rarely mentioned the toll it took on their health, their families, or their sense of self. In many ways, Samuel Smiles was the opposite of Charles Pooter. Where Pooter was small, embarrassed, and unseen, Smiles was prominent, admired, and respected. But both men lived under the same Victorian sky. Both felt the unrelenting pressure to appear strong, successful, and self-contained. Both understood, even if they never said it aloud, that a man's worth in society was measured not by his peace of mind, but by his productivity. And both men, in their own way, were slowly being crushed by the roles they had been given. Samuel Smiles died in 1904, widely honored. But even in his final years, he never stopped working, never stopped writing, never stopped pushing the very values that had quietly drained him. He believed in improvement, and he feared what would happen if he stopped. In that way, he was a true Victorian husband, always advancing, never resting, and rarely truly known. Victorian men wrote letters. They wrote often and beautifully, to friends, to sons, to brothers overseas, even sometimes to themselves. But these letters rarely said what mattered most. You'll find pages filled with inquiries about health, updates on business, observations about the weather. You'll read careful sentences like, "I trust this finds you in good fortune." The children continue their studies with vigor. We remain as ever in stable circumstance. But between the lines, there is another voice. The silences in these letters are often louder than the words. Take, for instance, the correspondence between two London clerks, Edward H. and Thomas P., now preserved in an obscure archive in Manchester. They wrote to each other for nearly 14 years. Over 200 letters survive. And yet, not once, in any letter, does either man mention emotion. No sorrow, no fear, no joy even. But then comes one peculiar entry. A letter from Edward, dated March 1871. It ends with a single line. Tell me, do you ever find yourself waking before dawn, quite sure something is wrong, but unable to name it? No reply to that question survives, but none was really needed, because every Victorian man knew what it meant. There was a kind of unspoken brotherhood, not built on support, but on shared restraint. You didn't speak your suffering aloud. You buried it in routine, in respectability, in your work. Even letters, that most intimate of forms, became another mask. It was safer to talk about the chimney needing repair or the weather in Brighton than to admit you felt like you were breaking, because to break was to fail, and to fail was to become invisible. There were exceptions, of course, men who confessed quietly, anonymously, often to doctors, sometimes to strangers, rarely to friends, but most said nothing. They carried their grief in the folds of a waistcoat, their anxiety in the slump of their shoulders, their despair in the way they stared at a page for hours without writing a single word. The letters endure, but what they don't say is what truly tells us who these men were. The day drags, and still you do not complain, because no one asks how you feel. And you're not supposed to have feelings. You are a Victorian husband. You are what you provide. And if you crumble inside, well, that's between you and the firelight. Not all Victorian diaries were meant to be published. Some were scribbled in ledgers wedged between bookkeeping notes. Some were written on repurposed scraps of paper tucked inside drawers. And some were meant to be burned. But not all were. One such diary belonged to a man named Henry Chilton, a name largely forgotten to history. He wasn't a writer. He wasn't famous. He was a mid-level railway accountant living in Clapham in the 1880s. His diary, preserved only because it was found in a box marked miscellaneous papers, tells a quiet, unraveling story. At first glance, it seems ordinary. Appointments, meals, notes on weather, remarks on his children's schooling. But gradually, a pattern emerges. The entries grow shorter. His handwriting becomes more cramped. The sentences more fragmented. One day he writes, "Wife went to see her sister, children at school. Rain. Post arrived late." A week later, "Missed the train this morning. Felt queer in the chest. Coal bill unpaid." Then, a month of silence, followed by, "Cannot seem to focus. Numbers won't stay put. Mr. H said I looked pale. I told him it's the light." The final entry is just 2 lines. "Sat in the study. The clock ticks louder than it used to. Cannot read tonight." And then nothing. There's no record of what happened next. No obituary, no scandal, just a man disappearing into the silence that surrounded him. We don't know if Henry Chilton died, resigned, or simply stopped writing. But his diary speaks volumes, because it is not unique. There are dozens, hundreds of diaries like it, unpublished, unfinished, uncelebrated, written by men who weren't falling apart in a dramatic fashion. They were simply eroding, too tired to write, too proud to confess, too bound by duty to ask for relief. They didn't rebel, they didn't escape, they just endured until the pages stopped, and the rest was silence. Victorian literature is known for its stiffness, its rigid prose, its moral clarity, but buried in the footnotes of the age was humour, dry, subtle, ironic, and often, if you look closely, aching. Much of this humour came from men writing about themselves, not in boast or confession, but in a kind of sideways glance, a clever deflection. Writers like Jerome K. Jerome, in 3 Men in a Boat, turned the mundane struggles of the middle-class Englishman into light comedy. At first glance, it's simple farce. A boating holiday gone awry, a dog that won't behave, a group of men who can't open a tin of pineapple without an axe. But underneath the absurdity, you sense something else. 3 men, each escaping, not for fun, but for relief. From routine, from duty, from expectation. One passage describes a character reading a medical textbook and discovering he has every disease listed, except housemaid's knee. It's funny, but it's also relatable, because Victorian men were not unfeeling. They felt everything, but had nowhere to put it, and so they laughed. Not to mock themselves, but to survive themselves. Another example is found in the lesser-read works of George Gissing. In New Grub Street, he paints a bleak, merciless portrait of literary men struggling under debt, class expectations, and emotional isolation. There is no heroism, no triumph, just tired men, failing quietly. And yet, Gissing's tone is often laced with irony, a kind of grim chuckle in the dark. Not because their pain isn't real, but because making it absurd was the only way to say it aloud. This was the genius of Victorian male humour. It didn't deny suffering. It dressed it in a waistcoat and had it trip over a rug, so that readers could laugh and, if only for a moment, feel seen, because for many men of the time, that was the closest they came to confession. A joke, a stumble, a sentence like, "I seem to be quite out of sorts, but of course, one must press on." And hidden behind the chuckle was a man holding himself together with ink. In Victorian Britain, medicine was advancing rapidly. Surgeries became safer, hospitals cleaner. Diseases that once spelled certain death were being catalogued, named, and, occasionally, treated. But there was one condition no one wanted to name: the mind in distress. Mental illness, especially in men, was wrapped in euphemism and shadow. Words like melancholia, nervous prostration, and neurasthenia were used to describe what we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, burnout. But these terms were not solutions. They were veils. A man could go to the doctor with a tightness in the chest, a heaviness in the limbs, or difficulty concentrating. He might receive a tonic, a sedative, a few days of rest. But he would not be told, in plain terms, what he was suffering from, because to name it was to threaten the very foundation of his identity. A man who could not cope was not truly a man. He was seen as soft, broken, embarrassing, and so most avoided treatment altogether. Doctors' journals from the time are filled with cases of men in their 40s and 50s reporting vague ailments, sleeplessness, palpitations, digestive trouble, dizziness. One physician in 1891 wrote, "I see no lesion in the body, and yet the patient appears thoroughly undone. He speaks with calmness, but I perceive his hands tremble when idle. He is, I fear, ill in a manner we have not yet named." Another noted, "A clerk, age 37, presents no physical infirmity, yet I am persuaded that he is at the edge of some abyss." Some of these men were gently referred to sanatoriums, places in the countryside with fresh air, bland food, and books. Others were simply told to rest, to take a sea voyage, to read less, to worry less, and then sent back to work, because the machine didn't stop for sentiment. There were exceptions, of course. A few doctors began to see the truth, but for most, the answer was silence. If you suffered, you were to suffer privately, with dignity, with restraint, and when the strain became too much, you simply disappeared from the ledger, marked retired early, died suddenly, removed to convalescence. No explanation, just another husband, lost to a society that didn't yet have the words to save him. Not every Victorian man slipped quietly into the shadows. Some fell, publicly. And when they did, the world rarely looked away with kindness. Take the case of Richard T., a solicitor in Liverpool, whose life was torn open in 1878 when his debts were made public. He had lived modestly, paid his bills, attended church. But one bad investment, one tipped the balance. His letters, seized as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, tell a slow-burning story of unraveling. Weeks before the collapse, he wrote to a colleague, "There is a sickness behind my eyes I cannot cure. I feel as though my skin no longer fits." And later, to his wife, "Do not be afraid. I will sort it all. I always have." But he didn't. The scandal spread, not because it was enormous, it wasn't, but because he was a gentleman. And a gentleman in Victorian England was expected to sink with style if he sank at all. He moved in with a cousin, tried to resume his practice quietly. But clients did not return. His wife withdrew from society. His son changed schools to avoid whispers. A year later, he died of what was officially called a sudden malady. But doctors noted he had grown dangerously thin, that he refused food, that he seldom spoke. The real cause, likely shame, likely something far less sudden than the report suggested. And his story was not unique. For many Victorian husbands, financial ruin was more than a loss of money. It was a collapse of identity. The man was the provider. And when he couldn't provide, he ceased to be. Even well-meaning friends might say things like, "He was never quite the same after the business folded," or "He faded somewhat after the unpleasantness." Because to fall in public was to become an object of quiet pity, and pity in that society was poison. The press treated such men as curiosities, examples, warnings, but their diaries, when they exist, reveal something gentler. A man who wanted to do right, who tried every day to keep everything intact, and who failed, not because he was weak, but because the weight was never meant to be carried alone. Every society has a role it assigns to men. In Victorian England, that role was clear, rigid, and merciless. You were to be the provider, the protector, the paragon of moral order. A man who showed no doubt, who confessed no fear, who bore every pressure with a straight back and a silent mouth. And most men did just that. But it was a performance. One so complete, so absolute, that even the men themselves forgot where it ended. They stood in church pews with bowed heads. They wrote, "Yours respectfully," at the close of stiff letters. They took off their hats for superiors and never once cried in front of their children. Because they believed, because they were taught, that strength meant silence, that dignity required invisibility. But the cost? It lived in the ulcer that never healed, in the bottle hidden in the drawer, in the sleepless nights spent staring at a fire too small to warm the room. And most of all, it lived in the words never spoken. The truth is, few Victorian husbands were monsters. Most were not tyrants. They were tired. Tired of never being able to rest. Tired of pretending. Tired of carrying a house, a name, a future, without ever being asked how they felt doing it. Some found small relief in diaries, in novels, in rare friendships built on quiet understanding. Others broke under the strain and vanished into the margins of history. We remember the great men, the inventors, the politicians, the explorers, but we forget the clerk who never missed a payment until the day he couldn't. We forget the father who smiled at dinner and then sat in the dark for hours afterward, unsure why. We forget the thousands of Charles Pooters, the Henry Chiltons, the Richard Tees, not because they weren't worth remembering, but because they didn't leave behind a headline, just a few fading pages, a worn waistcoat, and the quiet ache of a man who did everything he was asked to do, and was still, somehow, not quite enough. There is something deeply human about a letter that was never sent. It carries not only the words on the page, but the hesitation in the hand that wrote them. It is a whisper from the past, unfinished, unshared, and completely honest. And in attics, archives, and crumbling estate homes across Britain, historians have found them. Bundles of paper, bound with string, hidden behind false drawers, tucked into hollow books. Letters from Victorian men to their wives, their children, their employers, and to no one at all. Some were addressed but never sealed. Others bore no names, just initials or vague phrases like, "to whom it may concern." Many were never meant to be read, but now they speak more clearly than any speech or sermon of the time. One letter, dated 1876, was discovered inside a cracked writing desk sold at auction in York. The desk had belonged to a man named James T., a railway supervisor. The letter was folded inside an envelope labelled only, "Private, burn unread." It was never burned. Inside, James had written, "I have done what I could. If the sums do not balance, it is not for lack of trying. There are mornings when my hands shake too much to hold the pen, but still I sign the sheets. I sign them with a smile I cannot feel." He continued, "Please do not let the children blame themselves. I have tried to be good, tried to be strong, but I find myself thinner by the month, in body and in spirit. I am not sick. I am simply tired of performing." That phrase, "tired of performing," appears in more than one letter from this era. It tells us something crucial. These men did not always fear poverty or pain or even failure. They feared exposure, the breaking of the illusion they'd spent a lifetime maintaining. To be the man of the house meant more than authority. It meant being a constant, calm, competent, correct, even as everything inside you shifted. The unsent letters reveal the dissonance between the man others saw and the man who stared into the mirror at night. These weren't manifestos. They weren't cries for help. They were release valves, a place to tell the truth just once before folding it away forever. And when those letters are found, the room seems to go still, because you realize this wasn't rare. This was normal, hidden, but normal. And that's what makes it haunting. Among the most common themes in these unsent letters is money, or rather, the lack of it. Victorian society ran on appearances. Respectability wasn't just about virtue. It was about demonstrating control, order, prosperity. Even if that meant going into debt to do so. A man could live for years in quiet panic, borrowing to pay a bill, paying one creditor while avoiding another, adjusting his waistcoat to hide a fraying shirt beneath. And he would tell no one. Because to admit financial strain was to admit failure. One letter, found inside a hollowed-out book of sermons in Sussex, was dated 1888. It reads, "I do not know how long we can keep the second maid. I fear even her wages are beyond us now. But M insists the drawing room must be presentable for visitors, and she is not wrong. Still, I grow weary of hiding the bills." Another, written by a bank clerk in Leeds, says, "I have taken to delaying the butcher's payment until Thursday. The grocer has been kind, though I suspect he knows. If the children knew how close we were to losing the house, they would look at me differently. I cannot bear that. These were not dramatic declarations. They were quiet confessions, calculations, the arithmetic of dignity in decline. Some letters speak of mortgages, others of investments gone wrong. One man, a retired schoolmaster, wrote, "I sold my books today, the ones I read to the boys. I told them it was for space. I did not say it was for supper." None of these men were extravagant. They were not gamblers, not reckless. They were simply trying to maintain the illusion of enough for their families, for their neighbors, for themselves. In a world where a stained cuff or a missing button could lead to whispers. To admit insolvency was not just shameful, it was dangerous. Because once your respectability cracked, the rest could crumble quickly. What these letters reveal is not greed or vanity. They reveal fear. The fear of being seen as less than you appear. The fear of disappointing those who depend on you. The fear of losing not just your home, but your role within it. So you write it down, fold it quietly, and tuck it into a drawer no one opens, because the illusion must remain intact, even if the man behind it is beginning to disappear. Emotional language in the Victorian male vocabulary was elusive. You won't often find words like depressed, anxious, or grieving in these letters, but you will find phrases like, "Something is not right." "The air feels heavy more often than not." "I feel less myself than I once did." One man, a government clerk in Birmingham, wrote in 1894, "I do not believe I am ill, but I also do not feel quite well. It is not the body, exactly, but something else, something deeper, harder to mend." This paradox of acknowledging something wrong without being allowed to name it was common. Victorian men often described symptoms in physical terms: tightness in the chest, fog in the head, a strange stillness in the arms. It was safer that way. To say, "I cannot cope," would have sounded absurd, even dangerous. But to say, "My digestion is irregular," or "I wake with a ringing in my ears," that was permitted. One letter from a father of 5, tucked into an 1890 ledger of household expenses, says, "Each morning I wake before the sun and feel a dread I cannot name. I dress, I smile, I carry out the day. But at night, when the house is quiet, the dread returns. It is not pain, not fear, something in between, a weight with no clear shape." Another, written to a brother but never sent, reads, "If you should hear I have taken ill, do not worry. It is nothing new. It is simply the same feeling growing stronger, as though I am always preparing for something, but it never comes." These were men struggling with what today we might call existential fatigue. But back then, there was no language for it. You were either well or mad. There was no spectrum, no nuance, no room in the middle. And so, these men lived in the middle, and wrote about it quietly, vaguely, carefully. Their pain was respectable, measured, polite, and that's what makes it so easy to miss. But if you read closely, you'll see it. In the half-finished sentence, the blotched ink, the dates that suddenly stop. These weren't men crying out. They were men whispering, "I am not unwell, but I am unwell." And they were hoping someone someday would understand. Some Victorian diaries appear perfectly ordinary. They begin with weather reports, family updates, notes on work, shopping lists, and social visits. They're tidy, measured, proper. But sometimes, toward the end, they change. not suddenly, but subtly. The sentences grow shorter. The handwriting wobbles. The ink changes, sometimes from black to blue, sometimes to pencil, as if the writer no longer had the energy to refill a pen. And then, in many of them, something strange happens. Pages are missing, torn out, blotted beyond recognition, or, most hauntingly, blacked out with thick lines, inked over again and again until nothing remains. Historians call them void entries. They appear in dozens of journals, often toward the final pages. Sometimes just a single date, fully scribbled out. Other times, whole paragraphs drowned beneath ink. We don't know exactly why. Was it self-censorship? Shame? Grief? Was it a decision made in the moment, or a later attempt to erase something too painful to remember? One journal from a civil servant named Alfred M. shows 4 years of detailed daily entries. Then, in March of 1895, a sequence of 5 days, all violently scratched out. On the 6th day, a single line. I am still here. I think that is all I am now. No explanation, no return to normal, just silence. And then the diary ends 2 weeks later. Another man, a retired teacher, had written daily reflections for over a decade. Then suddenly he notes, no entry yesterday. Felt too strange inside. Not ill, just not well. The following entry is covered by pasted newspaper clippings, and nothing follows. There is a peculiar intimacy in these voids. They are not just absences, they are messages. The act of erasing something is still an act. It tells us that something happened, something that mattered, something that had to be hidden, even from oneself. Victorian men weren't trained to talk about their feelings, but sometimes the absence of words is a kind of confession. These blacked out pages are not blank. They are full of weight, full of silence, full of the things that couldn't be said, but needed to be marked. Victorian men rarely spoke to each other about emotional distress, but some, a quiet few, spoke to doctors. Not openly, not with tears or raised voices, but in a clinical, cautious way, through symptoms, through metaphors, and through avoidance. And in the notebooks of late 19th century physicians, we find glimpses of these men. Not by name often, just by initial, or profession, or age. Dr. Charles Hastings, a physician practicing in London in the 1880s, kept extensive notes. In one casebook, he writes, Patient, M, age 42, solicitor, complains of fatigue, restlessness at night, dullness of appetite, no physical cause detected, admits to feelings of emptiness, though insists he is not unwell, prescribed bromide, suggested sea air. Another, from a doctor in Bath, merchant, age 37, reports vague unease and a sense of dread in the bones, no observable fever, appears tense in the jaw and fingers. Wife says he seldom speaks more than a few words daily. Suspect melancholia, masked. These notes are restrained, like the men they describe, but they hint at a growing awareness that not all illness lives in the body, and that something was quietly eating at the hearts of respectable men. The medical terms were often clumsy. Male hysteria, neurasthenia, nervous prostration. But what they pointed to was a slow psychological exhaustion, a kind of soul weariness brought on by relentless expectation, constant emotional compression, and the daily theatre of masculine control. One physician wrote, in frustration, "These men do not weep. They do not speak plainly. They show up in waistcoat and tie, and explain their ruin in terms of digestion. It is as though sorrow must take a bodily form before it is permissible. There are stories of prescriptions for solitude, for mental idleness, for extended railway travel. Some were sent to sanatoriums. Some were told to walk in the country. Some were simply advised to speak less and breathe more. But none were told what we might tell someone today, that it's all right to be tired, that exhaustion does not mean failure, that a man can ask for help and still be a man. And so the doctors wrote it down. The men went home, and the cycle continued. Some unsent letters are filled with lists of things to do, things to say, things to fix. They read like plans, or apologies, or last attempts at order. But one letter, found in the attic of a boarding school in Dorset, stands apart. It was never signed, never dated. Just a single sheet of paper folded in half, with small, neat handwriting, and one endless sentence. It begins, "I have tried to be everything I was taught to be, to show up on time, to never be idle, to keep the children clothed, to be just stern enough but never cruel, to nod at my employer and laugh at the jokes I do not understand, to keep the garden in order and the bills hidden and the gin bottle in the drawer." It goes on. No punctuation, no break. To listen to my wife without appearing to listen. To tell my daughter she plays well even when I cannot hear the notes. To rise early and shave precisely and polish my shoes even though no one comments. To remain calm when the shutters rattle in wind and when the boy forgets his Greek and when the fire burns low before midnight. And it continues. Line after line, not a confession, not a cry for help, just a stream of duties, expectations, performances, and exhaustion. It ends like this, and to never ask for more than this, never let anyone see, never say I am not enough, because I am the man, and the man does not stop. And that's it. No farewell, no signature. Just folded, tucked away, and forgotten, until someone found it. And in that moment, the illusion breaks, because we're not reading about history anymore. We're hearing a voice, one that sounds painfully familiar. A man trying to hold it all together, one sentence at a time. This letter, like so many others, reminds us. These men weren't silent because they had nothing to say. They were silent because the world wasn't listening. Not then, but now we can. Sometimes it wasn't a letter or a diary that revealed a man's quiet suffering. Sometimes it was a room. Small, unremarkable spaces tucked away in Victorian homes, usually claimed as the study, the smoking room, or simply his chair by the fire. These were not just luxuries. They were refuges, the one place in the house where a man might sit and stop performing. In some homes, this room was barely more than a nook. A writing desk, a bookshelf, a lamp, a single worn chair. But if you look closely, you'll find the signs. Scraps of paper with arithmetic that doesn't add up. Books with lines underlined twice, or scribbled notes in the margins. Ashtrays filled to the brim, even when the man was not known to smoke. And in many of these rooms, tucked away in drawers, are letters. Half written, never sent. One home in Kent, opened for estate sale in the 1920s, revealed a study left almost untouched since 1899. There, on the desk, was a letter addressed simply, "Myself." It read, "You are still here. You have not failed yet. But you are tired, and that is no disgrace. You are allowed to sit, to wait, to breathe, You have done your duty. Let that be enough, for now. It was unsigned. It wasn't dramatic, but it was perhaps the truest thing that man ever wrote. Victorian men were told to lead, to stand tall, to never waver. But sometimes, all they needed was a space to be small. Not weak, not broken, just unguarded. And so they built these little rooms, not to hide, but to rest, to lay down the weight of being a husband, a father, a provider, if only for an hour, to write something no one would read, to sit in the dark, not with fear, but with stillness. That stillness wasn't surrender, it was survival. Because when the world demanded that you be a monument, a small room with a lamp could feel like mercy. Not all letters are lost. Some survive not in archives or attics, but in echoes. In the quiet way your grandfather looked out the window after dinner. In the silence between your father's words. In the way a man sits with his shoulders slightly curved forward, as if still carrying a weight long after he's put it down. The Victorian husband, as a figure, is gone. The waistcoat is no longer worn. The morning post arrives by phone, not by servant. The parlour, the walking stick, the wax seal, all relics. But the emotional script still lingers. That script which says, do not feel too much, do not ask too much, and whatever you do, never fall apart where anyone can see. The letters these men never sent weren't just personal. They were generational. They passed down more than stories. They passed down a template of endurance mistaken for strength, of silence mistaken for virtue, of tiredness mistaken for failure. And now, here we are, reading their words, hearing finally what they could not say aloud, that behind the stern portraits was fear. Behind the firm handshakes, uncertainty. Behind the man of the house, just a man. Wanting to be good, terrified to be seen as weak, and too proud, or too ashamed, to admit that he was tired. If there's one thing these unsent letters teach us, it's this, that the hardest part of being a Victorian husband wasn't providing, it was pretending. Pretending you were never afraid. Pretending the numbers always added up. Pretending you never needed to write this letter in the first place. But they did write them. They folded them. They hid them. And now, at last, we can read them. Not with pity, but with understanding. Because silence is heavy, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Even a letter never sent can still be received. The parlour is lovely, tasteful, bright, filled with the scent of polish and flowers. The lace curtains glow in the afternoon light. The piano is dusted. The fire is set just right, not too large, not too small. Guests step in and marvel at the wallpaper. Such a fine pattern. Is it French? It is. You paid for it. You know exactly how much it cost. Down to the shilling. But you smile modestly and say, my wife chose it. Because she did. And because that's what one says. Your role in the parlour is simple. To fund it. Not to design it. Not to inhabit it. To maintain its existence from the edges. It is her stage. And you, if you appear at all, are background. You sit in the correct chair, speak when addressed, laugh at the right moments, pass the sherry. But your presence is not essential. Only your absence would be noticed as a disruption. Everything in this room, from the embroidered footstool to the brass clock on the mantel, is a symbol of taste, of stability, of success. And all of it rests on your invisible labor, your work, your worry, your silent endurance. The children play here carefully. The dog is not allowed. The windows are always clean, though you're not sure who tends them anymore. Guests gather here after church. They comment on the garden, the music, the weather, but not on you, because in this space you are not a person. You are proof that the family is prosperous, that the marriage is solid, that everything, from the curtains to the conversation, is in perfect order. And so, you remain still, like the wallpaper, like the clock, not unhappy exactly, just unnecessary. You built the house, but the house no longer needs you to feel like home, only to remain standing. Every family had its script. Yours was written before you were born. Act 1, school, Latin, discipline. Act 2, employment, courtship, wedding. Act 3, respectability. And in the parlor, where so many of life's performances unfolded, you were expected to play your role with quiet perfection. You were the head of the house, but not its heart. The guests who visited never saw your early mornings, the long hours at the office, the accounts balanced by candlelight. They didn't see your fraying cuffs, or the way your hands trembled when you sipped your tea just before the rent was due. They saw a gentleman, a man with a home, a family, a future. They didn't ask how you felt, and you didn't tell them. You held the door, you poured the wine, you smiled on cue, and somewhere along the way, you disappeared, because the more you succeeded at playing the part, the more invisible you became. When you provided, no one clapped. When you broke down, no one looked. There were rules in the parlor. How to speak, how to sit, how to arrange the furniture. There were rules for you too. You did not speak of business. You did not mention debt. You did not frown. You did not slouch. You did not let your eyes linger on the fire too long. It made people uncomfortable. So you learned to stay upright, polished, presentable, predictable, even when you felt like drifting. And when the guests left and the fire burned low, you sat in the same chair, in the same room, but now without the performance, still present, still upright, but now utterly alone. Not because no one loved you, but because no one saw you. Only the role, and you had played it too well. When you first bought the house, it felt like a triumph. A mortgage signed, a hearth lit, a brass knocker with your name. You stood in the empty parlor and imagined what it would become. A place of laughter, music, comfort. And in a way, it did. But not for you. As the years passed, the parlor grew more beautiful. Paintings were added, drapes replaced, piano tuned, china set. But it didn't grow more comfortable, because it was never meant to hold you. Only what you symbolized. Your boots left marks on the rug. Your pipe left a scent in the curtains. So gradually, you stopped entering the room altogether. You told yourself it was for her, for guests, for quiet. But the truth, you no longer belonged there. You belonged in the study, the hallway, the doorway. A man who paid the bills, but not the one who sat in the upholstered chair. Because the cost of being the man of the house was that you never got to live in it fully. You were its scaffolding, its skeleton. And bones do not decorate the parlor. Years later, when the children are grown and the visitors come less often, the room remains untouched, still lovely, still fragile, still curated. And you pass it each morning as you always have, with your cup, your coat, your silence. A house is not a home when it has no space for your weariness, no room for your uncertainty. A house is not a home when you are always rehearsing inside it. And so you continue, because there is dignity in maintenance, in holding it all up, even if no one ever thanks you, even if you never quite feel at home. Because you are a Victorian husband, and your greatest act of love was vanishing into the wallpaper. So now, the fire is low, the gaslight dims, and the last footsteps of the day have faded down the stairs. The house is still, and you, the man who held it all together, are finally sitting, not in the parlor, not at the dinner table, but in your own chair, in your own room, with the door half closed and the world half forgotten. Tonight, we've walked through another man's life. Not a king or a soldier or a scandal maker, just a husband, a clerk, a name scratched into a census record and then forgotten. But his story, like so many others, was never really lost. It was hidden, in letters never sent, diaries half finished, rooms arranged with care but empty of comfort. And now that we've listened, we know a little more about the silence behind the collar, the effort behind the smile, the quiet cost of being everything for everyone and nothing for oneself. So before you close your eyes, take a breath. Let the weight of the past settle gently. You do not have to hold up the house tonight. You do not have to wear the role. You are here. You are enough. And remember, even the quietest lives leave echoes worth hearing.